Shalom and welcome again to Seekers of Meaning, the podcast TV arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Advis. Thank you very, very much for joining us today in what I know is going to be a very, very interesting and exciting conversation with our guest today, Rabbi Shmuly Yanklowitz, coming to us from beautiful Phoenix, Arizona, where it's probably a balmy like 30 degrees. And welcome back, Shmuly. We want to talk to you about this brand new book of yours, a really interesting book called 45 Great Philosophers, and what they mean for Judaism. This is a very, very interesting departure from some of your previous books and previous podcasts. And for my colleagues out there or directors of education, take a look at this book and think about an adult education mini class or a series of classes, but also in youth grouping, because in a confirmation or a camp setting, I think this could be a very, very interesting curriculum to spark a tremendous amount of conversation. You do not need a PhD in philosophy to walk through this book. So Shmuly, Baruch haba, welcome. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing today?
Baruch hanimsa, great to see you, Rabbi Richard Advis. Always great to be with you and doing great here out in the Phoenix heat. Yeah. And a delight to talk with you.
So this is a really, really interesting book and a little bit of a departure from some of the other books that you've joined us with. In your introduction, you quote a very, very famous passage from the Ben Zoma passage about learning from other people and as a pathway to wisdom. What drew you to do this? This is a very, very different approach. What drew you to write 45 Great Philosophers?
Thank you for asking. And I love that Ben Zoma quote from Pirkei Avot 4:1, because you might have thought that the wise one was someone who has a doctorate or someone who has rabbinic ordination or someone who completed the Talmud or the like, or whatever the case is. But in fact, it's not what you know, it's how you relate to other people's wisdom that makes you wise, according to Ben Zoma. The wise one is one who can learn from everyone. And Maimonides himself says that in his introduction to the Shemona Prakim, his 8 chapters, that we should learn from anyone. It doesn't matter where wisdom comes from. And so part of it is learning from our hearts, from our reason, from our ancestors, from our parents, from our children, learning from nature, learning from science. And moral philosophy has always been my great passion. The great questions of ethics, of what does it mean to live a good life? And what are our responsibilities to other people? And I think that Judaism comes alive when it's in dialogue with other voices, whether that's Christian voices or Muslim voices. It's Aristotle, it's Confucius, it's David Hume or Wollstonecraft, it's Sartre, Levinas, that being in dialogue actually helps to animate our most cherished values. And so those are the questions that keep me up at night. What are our charitable obligations? What does it look like to enact moral leadership? What does it look like to fulfill our responsibilities as citizens?
So is there such a thing as Jewish philosophy, or as Ben Zoma and as you're alluding to, is Jewish philosophy really an amalgamation of things that we have picked up through our journey for the last, literally 3,000 years?
That's such an interesting question. You know, I would reject 2 kind of extreme views. One would say that Judaism is kind of pure. It existed outside of dialogue with other cultures. That's false. And I would also reject the other view that basically says Judaism is just a kind of a product of culture. I think that what's unique about Judaism's history is that the rabbis constantly sought to preserve its essence while also adapting and evolving in relationship to other cultures. Judaism doesn't encounter another culture, it exists within it. So when the Babylonian Talmud is being written in a Zoroastrian culture, the rabbis are engaged with Zoroastrianism. And when Maimonides is in Islamic, Spain or Islamic Cairo, he's very much being influenced by that. And the rabbis in Eastern Europe, in regards to, Christian influence and and German Enlightenment, and of course, American Judaism. And that's not something for us to be shy about or embarrassed by. It's not in a great assimilation that we've been influenced by cultures. Rather, the question is, how can we be intentional? How can we be affected by cultures and affect cultures, but be intentional what we want to bring in and what we want to keep out? For some people, whatever TikTok says is MS. That's the truth. Oh, TikTok said it. There it is, right? How do we actually bring the best of American society and leave the worst out?
Yeah, and the reason why I wanted to ask you then, and thank you for that answer, is because I was trained by a history professor at the Hebrew Union College, Dr. Ellis Rifkin of blessed memory, and he was a follower of Hegel, who finds his way into the book, and the whole dialectic of preservation, adaptation, and innovation, which he drilled into us, but which is true, is exactly what you were talking about. And one of the challenges of teaching now our own people who have, in my opinion, this editorial, very little knowledge of real history, because nobody studies it anymore. The idea that we were part of all these other cultures and took, in many cases, whether it was philosophy or music, Jewish music, it's German music, it's this, and adapted to our own particular needs and culture and times. So this is why I think what you're doing in this book is so very, very powerful, because the leadoff batter in the book is Confucius. So talk to me about, wait a minute, Confucius? But you relate Confucius to the concept of being a mensch in the book. So talk to me about that, because I guarantee you the majority of our people will say, well, Confucius, had a little Yiddish Tom in it. Hey, right?
Yeah, well, it's so interesting what you're saying, and it's just so true that Jewish philosophy has always been immersed within the other philosophies around us, that Plato was so influential on Jewish thought. Maimonides is practically quoting Aristotle over and over on the Golden Mean and the like. In fact, the Shmona Prakim, which I mentioned earlier, Maimonides' book of the 8 chapters, he says at least 5 of the 8 chapters are like, I don't want to call it plagiarized, but it's basically word for word from an Islamic philosopher. And he says, like, I'm not going to say who this is from because you'll disregard it, but just know I've been very influenced. Soloveitchik is basically quoting Kant and Kierkegaard over and over. Of course, on the other end, there's many Jewish Marxists, the Jews who became communists, very influenced, by that zeitgeist. Now, the only 2 Eastern thinkers I mentioned are Confucius and Buddha.
Right. And
many people think of these the opposite. Oh, Christianity is love and Judaism is law, right? We're totally separate. Or Buddhism is opposite from, a Jewish perspective on suffering. But the truth is, of course, there's many differences. And yet there's so much overlap as well. Not only overlap, areas where when we look at Confucius in relationship to Pirkei Avot, we can learn something new about how to read our own texts. We can learn about Menschlichkeit, as you say. And I think that is a non-theory-based approach. That there's an assimilation approach, which basically says, whatever the world says, we're in. And then there's a closed-off approach that says, we can't study these people because they're going to influence us. No, we may not be afraid. We can study this and it will enhance our Judaism. Actually, that our Jewish wisdom will come to life when we bring it in dialogue with other wisdom in the world.
Why do you think so? Just to pick up on this, because look, we live right now in this country in a time of great division, and in many cases, religiously, a lot of the interfaith work has been backburnered. Why do you think people are so right now afraid to be in dialogue with another religious tradition or other? What's going on? What do you think?
Yeah, I love that. Well, the first level I would say is that in Bill Gates's closing blog post a few years ago, he wrote that the greatest crisis in America is the breakdown of trust. The trust of media, the trust of science, the trust of politicians, the trust of clergy. Trust has broken down. And he says when trust breaks down in democracy, a lot of horrific things can start to happen. And so part of it is, what does it look like to rebuild trust in American society? And the other part is that given our social media world, where the average American reads 0.6 books a year, people are just reading headlines. And there's lots of triggers that just move people into a tribal way of thinking that is not intellectually critical and produces this mass polarization as it relates to partisanship, as it relates to the war in Gaza, as it relates to a whole bunch of aspects of truth that we used to agree upon as Americans in democracy and in just basic virtue. And so part of why I wrote this now is, how do we kind of reopen our minds to thinking about virtue and thinking about ethics and thinking about the simplicity and the complexity of all of that. And I think we're at a very dangerous time right now where the media kind of controls what Americans think about. And Americans seem to be okay with that. Just, bandwagoning on some ideology of the day. And we just had a Republican National Convention. Now we're in a Democratic National Convention. Whether we lean liberal or conservative or centrist or progressive or far right, whatever it is, like, we should be willing to not be afraid to ask questions and to contradict ourselves at times. And I think that one of the great things about Jewish moral philosophy is that it doesn't embrace simple wisdom. It embraces the complexity of dialectical thinking, of tensions of values.
Right, tension.
And that's what I hope we can return to.
Yeah, and a lot of the work, this is a pet thing of mine. In a lot of the work that we do in Jewish sacred aging, with the demographic, now multi-generational demographic, but still a demographic that's getting older and contemplating their own reality and mortality, what emerges are these tensions that we live with, and the struggle of how to deal with the tensions and make sense out of them. And that in many ways becomes a very spiritual enterprise. So one of the philosophical all-stars, if I could lapse into baseball terminology, is, and you mentioned him before, Aristotle. And in the section on Aristotle, you write, the ultimate purpose of creation then is for human beings to elevate the spiritual life force in all things to bring us to a better world. The spiritual life force in all things. And so he's, as you mentioned, the direct line into Maimonides. Talk to me a little bit about, in more detail, about this linkage between Aristotle and the Rambam.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that. And it's funny because in that quote, the word there was creation. And that is actually one of the few places where Maimonides will not be Aristotelian,
right?
Because the Greek thinkers are very committed to an eternal world. And Maimonides is very committed to the Jewish theology of wherever it was, there being some creation of the world. And so, yeah, I mean, in that time period, the medieval period, to be philosophically engaged was the Greeks. And of course, we've seen how valuable that is, but we've also seen how limiting that can be as well at this point. But that is part of what makes Maimonides so great, is not only his book of laws, Mishnah Torah, not only his commentary on the Mishnah, but his Moreh Nevuchim, his guide for the perplexed. And there he's asking the big questions of philosophy. And a big part of his conclusion, and here I'm going to use some anachronistic terms, he's not a deontologist like a Kant, where it's all about duty and rules. He's not a utilitarian and a consequentialist like many of the laters, that we explore in this book, like Bentham and Mill. And he is a virtue ethicist. He believes in virtue ethics, like Aristotle, which means what matters is how to be a mensch in the world. So, for example, if I have a million coins, the question is not how can I give 500,000 here and 500,000 there to have the greatest impact. How can I give one coin 1,000,000 times so that I become more charitable myself. And that is very much an Aristotelian influence around the cultivation of virtue. And fast forward 900 years, you have the birth of the Musar movement with Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who is picking up exactly on that point. So there is this continuity. And so interesting enough, Maimonides is reading the Greeks through Arabic, through the Islamic philosophers. So there's kind of a double dip there. He's influenced by the Islamic society, and through them, the Greek philosophy. And Aristotle and Plato, of course, are very different in their thinking, and he's going to choose this rationalist bend rather than this mystic bend, although it's complicated. How that gets separated. But he is really our first Jewish philosopher immersed on this level, the greatest of Jewish philosophers and the greatest of Jewish legalists. And those two aren't contradictory, because Jewish ethics can never be fully separated from Jewish law. The philosophical tradition is always connected to that Talmudic legal tradition. And I think it's that Talmudic process, what people call Socratic method, this dialectical back and forth, which is a big part of what enables such a Jewish comfort with philosophy in the first place.
We're speaking with Rabbi Shmuly Yanklowitz on his brand new book, 45 Great Jewish Philosophers and What They Mean for Judaism. And this is a tour de force. No matter where you're reading, Shmuly brings the Jewish component, the little linkage, the influence, the adaptation to bear as you walk through history from Confucius up to the present time. We're going to be right back with Shmuly, and want to ask him about this guy, what's his name, Spinoza. We'll be right back after this message.
For 20 years, the Lubetkin media companies have been producing award-winning audio and video programs. We produce audio podcasts, documentaries, seminar panels, conference speaker videos, tribute videos, and family legacy videos. And of course, the Seekers of Meaning TV show and podcast for Rabbi Richard Address and JewishSacredAging.com. I'm Steve Lubetkin, and I'd love to invite you to explore the ways that we can tell your story in sound and images. Please visit our website at beingthemedia.com, where you'll see examples of our work for other clients. And if you'd like more information, please email steve@beingthemedia.com. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you out there on the net. Take good care.
We're back with Shmuly Yanklowitz and his book, 45 Great Jewish Philosophers and What They Mean to Judaism. Baruch Spinoza. Shmuly, is Spinoza's time, has it come?
Spinoza's time is now. I was just in Amsterdam, and I wanted desperately to go to his house there, but I did not get that chance to do that. But I am a big advocate for lifting the ban on Spinoza. Technically, the ban still exists.
Really?
And, yeah. I mean, one might say the ban ends when people die, but the ban was never officially lifted. And I think that part of us not being afraid of philosophy is to lift that ban. Spinoza was incredibly thoughtful and generative, even if he's going to, contradict, some core theological tenets of Judaism, as a pantheist. But he is ahead of his time, so far ahead of his time. He has nowhere to live. He never joins the Christian community, but when he's banned from the Jewish community, he essentially has nowhere to go. But he's not afraid of that. He is not afraid of the ban. And I think we can be inspired by his fearless attitude to ideas. Today, we live with so much social conformity. We're afraid to ask controversial questions. We're afraid to come to certain conclusions that contradict the social norms. Spinoza can give us courage to do that. And he is giving birth to biblical criticism. He is giving birth to a whole new relationship to nature theologically. And we should return to Spinoza and the big questions he asks.
Fast forward, we don't have enough time to just walk through all this, all these philosophers. As I said, it's a multifaceted class on it. I hope you teach a class in this. One of the more popular gentlemen in the birth of existentialism and religious existentialism, and of course that came into Judaism in the 20th century a lot, Sean Kierkegaard. And his influence, you write in one of the paragraph on, or the chapter on Kierkegaard, he says, "For me, Jewish practice can be an antidote to the paradox of freedom described by Kierkegaard. By limiting my life to the options within a set of Jewish path, I and others find that there is a higher freedom in eliminating some of the overwhelming number of choices we can make. By following Jewish practice, one makes themselves smaller. By limiting your options, you can be besimcha." The paradox of freedom. It's a great line. And I was reading this as, oh my God, this is the Akedah, that in order to be truly free, we have to accept limitations on ourselves. Talk to me a little bit about you and Kierkegaard and the paradox of freedom.
Yes, I've been so influenced by the existentialists, perhaps more than any of these others. For Kierkegaard, the hero of faith is Abraham. Abraham's ability to sacrifice his own moral intuition as a hero of faith is, for Kierkegaard, what religious existentialism is about. Now, I personally will reject that approach, although I find it very compelling. I think that we can never sacrifice our moral intuition, our moral conscience, in the name of faith. But what I find so compelling about Kierkegaard here is that I have no need, even though I'll never know if there's a God or not, I have no need to be stuck in that question and other elementary questions, even though they're fun to engage. I will come to a conclusion, and then I can go deeper in my life. And then I'll come to another conclusion, and I'll go deeper. There's no reason to question, oh, is my wife the best wife I could have found? No, this is the wife I've chosen. She's wonderful. I'm very happy to be married to her, and I'm going to lean into that relationship. So too, should I really have been a rabbi? Maybe I could have been a CEO. I could have been a politician. No, that's the choice I made. Now I'm going to lean in to be the best I can be. And I think that we live in an era of a paralysis of choice, where people are often so confused because consumerism has become our primary identity in many ways. And we're just flooded with choices that we rarely fully lean in and affirm our identity, affirm our commitments. And I think that that's one of the great opportunities of religious existentialism, to say, to find our freedom through affirming the deepest choices. Now, so Kierkegaard has deeply influenced me in that regard. A few of these philosophers who are still alive who influenced me: Kwame Appiah, who is a living philosopher in New York, who's gay Ghanaian philosopher, has influenced my thinking on a number of issues. Martha Nussbaum is one of the reasons I went vegetarian. Peter Singer helped me influence me to donate a kidney. Chomsky, who I have many disagreements with, and was torn on whether to put Chomsky in the book, has also been an influence around thinking about politics and cognition and speech. And so these thinkers are personal for me. But the one you touched on, Kierkegaard, perhaps more than others in a lot of ways, because I think he really gets to the core of what it means to be human. And Sartre, who's in the existentialist tradition as well, I think the power of choice and the power of freedom.
You mentioned Nussbaum. Talk to me a little bit about the women philosophers that you included. Are there an increasing number of female scholars now talking about philosophical issues? And if so, especially in the Jewish community, who would they be?
Okay, awesome. I love that. So, so I initially intended this to be 40. And precisely because of this reason, that we're mostly dealing with white men, because that was the history of philosophy. I extended it further so I could get, a little more diversity towards the end, as I mentioned with Appia, and then a number of women thinkers. I have Mary Wollstonecraft in the 18th century, and then Hannah Arendt of the early 20th century, mid 20th century, who of course is Jewish and involved. And I explore the Eichmann trial.
Right.
Simone de Beauvoir, who's in relationship with Sartre, and in the existentialist tradition, and then into Martha Nussbaum, who is still alive and just a really profound thinker, and I think that there continues to be a lack of women's voices in this field, and that's something for us to really amplify those voices, and there is a sense that that in on the one hand, some of these women philosophers are speaking directly to women, speaking directly to a new theology, a new feminism, and then there's others who are just philosophers and are engaging, the masses and beyond the issue of just gender. And one of the philosophers, theologians that I've kind of been very influenced by is Professor Tamar Ross, who lives in Israel, and she's a scholar of Rav Kook and other thought, and is a kind of next generation feminist, and has been just a leading thinker both within the texts of Jewish thought and within the realm of philosophy. Again, through Rav Kook and through Hegel, so she's certainly one among many others, and I would encourage us to engage the full spectrum of philosophy as it relates to the rationalists, the postmoderns, the feminists, the existentialists, and to bring in the diversity of voices as much as possible.
Do you sense, before we conclude, you're talking and it just triggers something in my mind and about the consumerism. Do you think in our contemporary American Jewish society, there's a retreat from intellectualism and this
Absolutely.
and asking these great big questions?
Yes. Just before that, I want to raise up one Jewish philosopher I'm reading now. Her name is Lori Zoloth. She wrote Ethics for the Coming Storm, Climate Change and Jewish Thought, and published by Oxford and Press. And she is a bioethicist and is dealing here with Jewish philosophy and with climate change, which I find very interesting. Yes, the de-intellectualization of Jewish life is something very concerning to me. On the one hand, rabbis became professionals, and that was really great. Rabbis now were pastors. They were trained to be speakers, trained to be bedside comforters, trained in funerals and ritual leadership and the like, and trained to be professionals like doctors and lawyers. And that was really wonderful that people could respect the career more. And on the other hand, one thing that was lost in that training was training rabbis as intellectuals. Now, of course, rabbis are well versed in core texts and the like, but I think that it used to be that rabbi was primarily scholar, and it's a good thing that that's not solely the case anymore. But I would like to see all of our communities raise up that scholarship. And one of the reasons there's not as much of a need for rabbi as scholar is because the communities aren't looking for that as much. Because there are three roles, three primary identities, and two are winning out. One, as I mentioned, is the consumer. The second is citizen, the voter. Americans are very animated by what they buy and by how they vote. Those are two central identities. The third is a member of society, arts, culture, religion, volunteerism, and that is dying. That is dying. Where how people engage in politics and how people buy stuff is dominating. And the rebirth of ideas, of talking about culture and music and philosophy and art and the human experience And the stuff you do, aging and life, it's just is so needed. And I think that that's what makes Judaism great. What makes Judaism great has been our commitment to ideas, our commitment to asking hard questions, our commitment to thinking outside the box and pushing back against the norms.
Yeah, I think one of the great joys of doing in our constituency of Jewish sacred aging is that people, because of where we are in life, do want to ask the great questions and looking back and saying, really, what was this about? What was it worth? What did I do? It's sort of like a personal book of Ecclesiastes in many ways, that and it's fun, and a huge rise amongst our generation of saying, just I need to know what my tradition says. I don't want any more Bubba Mices and miracle stories, but I want to know why. Want to know why. By the way, Lori Zoloff up there, you can't see it. There's her classic work on Judaism and healthcare. Brilliant book, a trend-setting, pioneering work from about 15 years ago on healthcare. So if you get a chance to study with her, I've heard her speak. She's brilliant. Shmuly, 45 great Jewish philosophers and what they mean for Judaism. Thank you very much for sharing some of these insights. I wish you just success with the book. Stay healthy, a peaceful and healthy and joyous new year as well to you and your family. Continue all the good work that you're doing, and just thank you for being with us. And we look forward to the next book and coming back. And if you get to Philly, let me know.
Amen. Thank you so much. And Shana Tova to you and to all listening today.
To all of you, thank you very, very much again for joining us on today's edition of Secrets of Meaning, the podcast TV arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. Again, if you'd like to help support our work, go to the website, jewishsacredaging.com. Click on the donate button, and we appreciate anything you can do. We really do. Again, our podcasts are produced at the center of the broadcast center of Lubetkin Media Companies in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and a shout out to our producer, Steve Lubetkin. If you'd like to make a comment and get in touch with us about the shows or ideas, just feel free to email me at rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com. Until we meet again in the next edition of Secrets of Meaning, I wish you much joy and happiness, especially as we approach the new year. To all of you, stay healthy, and especially be kind to one another. Shalom, Todah.